I'll edit out some of the philosophy, but I'll try to let Einstein speak as much as possible in his own words. Now, his scientific achievements were so great, they tend to overshadow all other aspects of his life. But he was a fascinating human being. And as Pugwashites, we are all familiar with Einstein's last political act, when a few days before his passing, he signed the founding document of our movement, the so-called Russell-Einstein Manifesto, a statement that warned humanity of the risk of universal annihilation. But rather than focus on that final act of Einstein's political life, I would like to take this opportunity to look back at his thoughts and activism in the pre-nuclear age, when Einstein sought to establish a culture of peace, whose foundation he considered essential for the dignity and intellectual freedom of every individual. Now, we can sum up Einstein's approach to risk reduction in a single building. I'm afraid I can't show it to you. It was conceived by two diplomats, a Russian, Fyodor Fyodorovich Martensa, and an American, Andrew Dixon White. Now, I've shown a picture of this building in a couple of public talks, and when I've asked a lay audience to name it, not a single person could answer. That is perhaps indicative of the localized political culture we have manifested today, where such institutions have become remote to public discourse. But it was not always the case, and certainly not so for Albert Einstein, who firmly believed that the idea behind such an institution was our last best chance to save the world. The Peace Palace is what you should be seeing, is of course the stately home of international law, conceived and built to honor and empower a vision of that most civilized of institutions, the Permanent Court of Arbitration, whose conception was so mighty that it dared to finally end that scourge of civilization, which has ravaged culture and progress at every stage of world history, the Universal Specter of War. When Andrew White wrote to Carnegie, pleading for the funds to build the palace, he said, "A temple of peace where the doors are open, in contrast to the Janus temple, open in times of peace and closed in case of war. Were such a fabric to be created, people would make pilgrimages from all parts of the civilized world to see it. It would become a sort of holy place, prized and revered by thinking persons throughout the world, and to which, in danger of war between any two countries, the minds of men would turn naturally and normally." When the First World War broke out in 1914, Einstein was shocked and devastated by both the carnage of war and the reaction within his intellectual milieu. His innocence was shattered, and he wrote to his friend Ernfest in December 1914, "The international catastrophe has imposed a heavy burden upon me as an internationalist. In living through this horrendous epoch, it's difficult to reconcile oneself to the fact that one belongs to that idiotic, rotten species which boasts of its freedom of will. How I wish that somewhere there existed an island for those who are wise and of good will. In such a place, even I should be an ardent patriot." On the 4th of October, 1914, 93 prominent German intellectuals famously published a manifesto appealing to the civilized world to recognize Germany's war effort as a noble cause of self-defense, reluctantly undertaken in the service of cultural superiority. It emphatically but incorrectly rebuffed Allied allegations about German war crimes during the recent invasion of Belgium. Among the signatories were some of the greatest scholars in the sciences and humanities, including numerous Protestant and Catholic theologians of diverse orientations. Within days of its publication, a friend of Einstein's, George Frederick Nicolai, composed a brilliant riposte, a manifesto to the Europeans, which he circulated among the faculty of the University of Berlin, where he held a chair in physiology. He wrote, "Anyone who cares in the least for a common world culture is now doubly committed to fight for the maintenance of the principles on which it must stand. Yet those from whom such sentiments might have been expected, primarily scientists and artists, have so far responded as though they had relinquished any further desire for the continuation of international relations. They have spoken in a hostile spirit, and they have failed to speak up for peace." While various colleagues privately expressed sympathy with these sentiments, only Einstein and two others agreed to sign it. Einstein was always an ardent pacifist, although he was forced to modify his approach over the course of his life. In a reply to a letter from an academic correspondent on February the 24th, 1918, Einstein wrote, "I greatly admire your versatility and entertaining style, although your ostentatious Teutonic muscle flexing runs rather against my grain. I prefer to string along with my compatriot, Jesus Christ, whose doctrines you and your kind consider to be obsolete. Suffering is indeed more acceptable to me than resort to violence. History alone will teach us whether we shall be led by the attitudes exalted by you and so many of your contemporaries." 10 years later, on the anniversary of the armistice, Einstein wrote, "The political apathy of people in times of peace indicates that they will readily allow themselves to be led to slaughter later. Because today they lack even the courage to give their signature in support of disarmament, they will be compelled to shed their blood tomorrow." The Kellogg-Briand Pact, officially the General Treaty for Renunciation of War as an instrument of national policy, is a 1928 international agreement attempting to eliminate war as an instrument of national policy, in which the signatory states promise not to use war to resolve disputes or conflicts, whatever the nature or whatever the origin in which arise among them. When Einstein was asked what institution should be created to assure the pact might prove more than a pious wish, he replied, "The peaceful settlement of international conflicts will be possible only when all armies and all forms of compulsory military service are abolished. As a beginning, it would be most helpful if prominent citizens were to advocate the principle of refusing military service." That same month, he sent a message to the No More War movement in London that said, "Every thoughtful, well-meaning, and conscientious human being should assume, in times of peace, the solemn and unconditional obligation not to participate in any war for any reason, or to lend support of any kind, whether direct or indirect." In October 1930, under the title of The World as I See It, Einstein vividly described his attitude towards militarism. "This brings me to the worst outgrowth of the herd life, the military system which I abhor. This shameful stain on civilization should be wiped out as soon as possible. Heroism on command, senseless violence, and all the loathsome nonsense that goes by the name of patriotism, how passionately I despise them. How vile and contemptible war seems to me. I would rather be torn limb from limb than take part in such an ugly business. I happen to think highly enough of mankind to believe that the specter of war would long since have disappeared had the sound common sense of the people not been systematically corrupted by commercial and political interests operating through the schools and the press." Einstein shifted from personal resistance to political activism, but he found little opportunity for definite progress. And in 1932, he wrote a long letter to Freud asking, "Is there any way of delivering the human race from the menace of war? It is common knowledge that, with the advance of modern science, this issue has come to mean a matter of life and death for civilization as we know it. Nevertheless, for all the zeal displayed, every attempt at its solution has ended in a lamentable breakdown." Einstein advocated setting up, by international consent, a legislative and judicial body to settle every conflict arising between nations. Each nation would undertake to abide by the orders issued by this body, to invoke its decisions in every dispute, to accept its judgments unreservedly, and to carry out every measure the tribunal deems necessary for the execution of its decrees. Einstein appealed for supranational organization, but found little sympathy, despite the increasingly obvious conclusion that the nation state was no longer capable of protecting its citizens, as further increases in military strength conferred diminishing guarantees and security. I would like to end by reading the text from a speech Einstein gave in 1932 at a meeting in Pasadena, California, to a school for diplomats and economists. "The greatest obstacle to disarmament has been the inability of most people to appreciate the enormity of the problem. Most objectives are accomplished in small steps. Think, for example, of the transition from absolute monarchy to democracy. But we are here concerned with an objective that cannot be attained slowly by step. So long as the possibility of war exists, nations will continue to insist on the fullest possible military preparedness to ensure their victory in a future war. And will find it unavoidable to educate the young people in warlike traditions and narrow nationalistic vanities. The glorification of the war spirit will proceed as long as there is reason to believe that situations may arise where that spirit will indeed need to be invoked for the purpose of waging war. To arm means simply to approve and prepare for war, not for peace. Hence, disarmament cannot come in small steps. It must come about at one stroke or not at all. To accomplish so profound a change in the life of nations, a mighty moral effort and a deliberate rejection of deeply ingrained traditions are required. Anyone who is unwilling to let the fate of his country, in the event of a conflict, depend without qualification upon the decisions of an international court of arbitration, and who is not prepared to see his country enter into treaties that provide for such a procedure without any reservation, is not really resolved to abolish war. This is a case of all or nothing. It should be emphasized that previous attempts to ensure peace have failed only because they were directed towards compromise solutions that were inadequate to cope with the task. Disarmament and security cannot be separated. They must come about simultaneously. Security will be achieved only when all nations commit themselves to abide by the decisions of an international authority. We are at present at a crucial crossroads in history. It is for us to determine whether a way to peace shall be found or whether man shall continue along the old road of brute force, so unworthy of our civilization. If we choose the way of peace, freedom for the individual and security for society await us. If we do not, slavery for the individual and annihilation of civilization threaten us. Our fate will be the one we deserve. Okay, thank you very much.